This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like, to check you have the tickets in your wallet first before you drive 2 hours to the big game. Seriously, you had one job. Now the closest you'll get to the 50-yard line is parking lot D. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
Welcome to the Big Ten Football Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Zach Guggenheim. It is the Halloween edition of the Big Ten Football Talk Podcast. Make sure to like, follow, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Hit that like button, smash that subscribe button. Make sure to comment, make sure to share with your friends. We appreciate all the support. We're going to start this edition of the Big Ten Football Talk Podcast. We're going to do a little bit of a trick or treat type of scenario. We're going to talk about how scared are you about a number of teams in the Big Ten in particular scenarios. From a ranking of 1 to 10, how scared are you? We'll talk about things like Penn State injuries, Ohio State coaching and offensive line, Nebraska and their bowl hopes, Rutgers and their bowl hopes, Lincoln Riley's future trajectory. We'll talk about Jed Fish. We'll talk about Indiana losing Kurt Signetti, Illinois potentially finishing on a bad note. How scared are you about those things? But before that, I want to get to something that is immensely scary, and that is the incompetence of Big Ten officiating. I'm putting that at an 11 from a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest. It's an 11 of how atrocious this is. I understand officiating is a hard job. It's a very hard job. And I see it at the NFL level. I see it at the college level. I even see it at the high school level because I cover high school football on Fridays. And I am mesmerized. Well, how do I put this? Mesmerized is probably not the right word. It is very easy to criticize officials. And there was a play this past Friday as I was covering a rivalry game in central Pennsylvania, the Coal Bucket game. It was the Shamokin Indians versus Mount Carmel, the Red Tornadoes. Amazing atmosphere, like amazing high school venue in the Silver Bowl. But what was amazing, there was a play. It would have gotten Mount Carmel a touchdown in that game. And instead, it was an offensive pass interference call, which was abysmal. It was an abysmal call. Like, those officials should never have made that call. It didn't change the outcome of the game, but it would have at least made things interesting in the game. It was 21-0 at that point. It would have made it 21-7. The game ended 21-0. So it was, it would have given the losing team some momentum to at least make it interesting in the second half. The pass I give them is, they have no technology to work with, right? Like, they're not working with anything. It's also a penalty. You can't review penalties. So I was like, okay, it was a bad call. They're not getting paid a ton, and they have no tech. Like, it's one of those things where it's like, all right, it stinks, but also, like, I get it. Here's what I don't understand about officiating in the college level. For one, you have a lot more technology. Two, the bad calls that are being made in Big Ten games can be reviewed, and sometimes they aren't. And third, they're getting paid a lot more. Like, I was looking online, there are certain sites that are saying that officials are getting paid anywhere from $800 to $2,500 a game. Other sites were saying $2,500 to $3,500 a game. Some sites were saying that some officials in the Big Ten are making close to six figures in a year. Now, I don't know which ones are the most accurate, but I would say if we take the median guess, it's probably anywhere from $30,000 to $60,000 a year to work 1 day a week for 3.5 hours. Now I get it. You got to be there early and you probably have to be there late. You probably have to refresh on certain rules. I'm sure you probably have to talk with different coaches and different programs and athletic directors. You got to travel to different destinations. I get it. It's not as easy as I just made it sound. But if you're going to tell me you're going to get paid that much and you can't spot a ball right, then what are we doing? There was a game, the Ohio State Nebraska game. They're driving at the end of the first half. Should have been a first down, like obviously a first down. You have a whatchamacallit. You've got a guy standing down the line to figure this out, to figure out like who is like to spot the ball. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words here. You've got a guy standing down the line and you can't get that right. And don't get me started on the Michigan-Illinois nonsense where he spotted it as a first down when he was out 4 yards beforehand. How do you screw up a spot that badly? I get it if it's inches, but you're supposed to have a guy down the line looking at the ball. And unlike the Michigan-Illinois one where they were at least able to fix it, they didn't fix the Nebraska one. It was atrocious. I mean, I don't get how you can screw that up that badly. Like you have a guy standing right there. And don't get me started on targeting, which I think is just a bad rule in general. I understand the intent of the rule. I agree with the intent of the rule. I think it is an awfully written rule. But you want to talk about officiating not being able to actually navigate that? I mean, we just had a play in the Ohio State Nebraska game where Arvell Reese was ejected for targeting after everybody watching the play said that's not targeting. And then the Big Ten came back and said, yeah, it wasn't targeting. He can play on Saturday. Like, how broken is this thing? When the whole point of replay is it has to be, it's indisputable evidence. Well, everybody's saying it's indisputable evidence. Well, we're not going to overturn it. And then you have other plays that are clearly not indisputable. And then it's so dumb. Officiating is broken and something has to be done. So what should we do? I think for one, I'm tired of conferences being in charge of officiating. Like, can we have a general council of referees for the whole league or for all of NCAA football? Not that I want to give the NCAA any responsibility, but the Big Ten, and I think conferences in general, they're not doing their job. And there's a conflict of interest, especially in non-conference matchups, as well as there's a conflict of interest in terms of ratings. And you got to get rid of that. Like, you got to get rid of as many conflict of interest as possible, because at that point you have the ability to accuse for cheating. I think the officials have to be held accountable to their bad decisions and their bad calls. I have rarely seen officiating crews fired. But it's getting to that point where if they're getting paid a lot of money to cover these games, then if they do a bad job, there needs to be a review and they need to get rid of some of these guys who stink. I mean, this is a job. You need to be held accountable. So you've got to do that. My good friend JR, who leads the Big Ten huddle, he says, put a chip in the ball to spot it. Like, I think that's an easy fix. Let's utilize the technology to make officiating easier because it is a hard thing. There are often bang bang plays. Okay. So can we use technology to upgrade this thing? But this has been abysmal. It's been abysmal for years, but somehow it gets worse and worse and worse every year. I've never seen this many blown spots by several yards. Inches is one thing, right? Inches is one thing. But yards? Like 3, 4, 5 yards? What are we doing? It's scary how incompetent these officials have been. And they need to be held accountable. And we need to start using technology to help the game rather than just to analyze the mistakes. Let's get technology in this thing, okay? Do something. It's abysmal, and it's when we're talking about it every game, every week of how bad the officiating is, it's getting away from the actual game, and it's frustrating. So let's fix it. So Tony Petitti, fix if officiating is going to stay in the Big Ten for now, Tony Petitti, fix it because it stinks. Okay. All right, we're gonna get away from that, and we're gonna talk about how different teams in the Big Ten should feel about different things. That's gonna be the kind of the tenor of this show, and we're gonna start with the team in Happy Valley, Penn State. Now, just as an aside, we are not going to talk about every team. We're going to talk about some, but we're not going to talk about them all. How concerned should you be about the injuries to Drew Aller and Denai Dennis Sutton? How concerned should you be? I will be honest. We talked about this on the Big Ten Huddle. According to some, there were some that were saying that they thought Drew Aller probably will play. Denai Dennis Sutton will probably play. And we talked about that on the Big Ten Huddle. Going back and watching that Wisconsin game, and I know I think James Franklin said they were day to day. So if you're a Penn State guy and you want to tell me what's going on, feel free. But they said game time decision. Those injuries did not look like day-to-day injuries, right? Drew Aller, it was more of a non-contact injury. He was being sacked, so it was a contact injury. But like, you didn't really see the severity. You just saw the twisting, and you're like, ooh, he can't plant. He can't do that. And Denai Dennis Sutton, it looked like a groin injury. And those are always a bit trickier. They're not maybe as severe, but they limit your explosiveness. And so if I'm putting this on a 1 to 10 of like, how severe are they? And the impact, I'm going to say it's about a 5. From a 1 to 10, it's a 5. And I'm going to say that for a couple reasons. One, I think I don't think Drew Aller's going to play on Saturday. I could be wrong, but I don't think he's going to play. And I'm not sure Denai Dennis Sutton plays either. He might give it a go, but I'm not sure he's going to be his normal self. And so I'm giving it a 5 because I do think it's going to hinder them from being able to play this week. Why I'm not going higher, despite the fact I'm playing Ohio State, is because I think Bo Prabula really acquitted himself nicely. And I think Penn State's defensive line is going to be okay without Denai Dennis Sutton. I think they're good enough to kind of weather the storm. Now, I did on the Big Ten Huddle pick Ohio State to beat Penn State, despite my reservations about Ohio State, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I don't think it's going to be as much because they're not able to rush the passer, even without Denai Dennis Sutton. And I think I'm not sure, even with Drew Aller, how much they're going to be able to attack downfield, despite some of the struggles in the defensive back end for Ohio State. So I I think Prabula actually adds an element that might actually unlock more of Kotelnicki's offense in the short term, which is not to say I think that he's better than Drew Aller. I wonder if that actually might be an advantage in this short window of time. So I think it's a concern because I don't know if they're going to play. And I would actually guess they're not going to play. But I also don't know if it matters. I don't know how big of an impact it is. So I'm going to go 5. I'm going to go 5. Let's go to the boys in Columbus. The Ohio State coaching. I'm going to do 2 for Ohio State. One is just their coaching and a second for their offensive line. I think for coaching overall, it's at about a 6. Here's why, and I'll say this for the defensive side first. And if we're just talking defensive coaching, it's a 9. Because I don't think they're on the same page. And despite the fact that Ryan Day said that Jim Knowles and Larry Johnson are on the same page last week, they're clearly not on the same page. They're clearly not. They talked about rotation. There was no rotation on Saturday. There was none. And that's abysmal. Now, I will say they did try some stuff on the defensive line. But Jim Knowles in the press conference said that he trusts Larry Johnson with the rotation, AKA he's not going to take my input. That's how I read that. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I do not like what is going on in Columbus right now on the defense. On the offensive side of the ball, I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think they looked abysmal against Nebraska. I also think Chip Kelly is better than what he showed, and I think he has a proven track record. So I am not as concerned offensively in terms of play calling and kind of the creativity. I think that was a bad game for Chip Kelly. I don't think you should expect that in Happy Valley. I don't think you should expect that against Indiana. So so I would say overall a 6 for coach, or did I say 6 or 7? I think I said 6 for coaching. I will say for offensive line, it's an 8. And I think if Ohio State loses against Penn State, it will be because of the offensive line without Josh Simmons. Josh Simmons is out for the season, and his replacement, Zen Mikulski, was abysmal. Now, Zen also got hurt. Ryan Day said he might be able to go this week. If he does, I think that might be a fireable offense. I don't think Zen's going to play at 70%. Like he was not good at 100%, let alone 70%. But I don't know what you do to mask some of the offensive line deficiency. And I think what's really scary is that they took on a pretty good defensive line, and it wasn't just Zen that was bad, it was everybody. Donovan Jackson, who was supposed to be an All-American coming into the season, he has not played like an All-American, and he looked awful. Seth McLaughlin, who has been the rock of that offensive line at center, has not been good, or was not good on Saturday. Tegra Shabola and Austin Saraveld, not good. Your best lineman was maybe your most criticized lineman in Josh Fryer on the right side. And he did do a good job. Everybody else was pretty bad. They couldn't run block to save their life, except for a couple QB sneaks. And the pass protection was awful. So how much of that was a sleepy game where Chip Kelly really challenged them to run the ball and they didn't and couldn't? I think that does explain some of it, but I don't know what combination you put out there to make things better. And if you're asking offensive linemen to shuffle, which I think they're probably going to do, are they going to have enough practice to have gelled in that front five? And I'm just not sure. I don't know if I trust that. So we'll see. I'm at an 8. And I think Chip Kelly can call plays to kind of get around that. But I I I ultimately settle on Ohio State beating Penn State this weekend, but it's like a 51-49 belief in that. And I think if Penn State wins, it's because Abdul Carter just goes off and Zane Durant goes off and they control the line of scrimmage. I think that is if you're an Ohio State fan, you should be very concerned. You should be very scared. So I've got an 8 for the offensive line, 6 for the overall coaching. We're going to go to Nebraska. Nebraska obviously played Ohio State really tough. Should have beat Ohio State, if we're being honest. But they are now they're still one game away from bowl eligibility, which is a huge mark for them because they have not been bowl eligible since 2016, I believe. So it's been 8 years. And the question is, for me, is how scared should Nebraska fans be that they don't end up bowl eligible? That maybe this is the beginning of the end for their season. And here's what I will tell fans of Nebraska. It's a 1. It's a 1. I think their defense, I think Indiana was an aberration. I think you got the worst version of Nebraska in that game. They took Illinois to the wire. They probably should have beat Illinois. They took Ohio State to the wire. They probably should have beat Ohio State. Granted, I think they got Ohio State's D- game, but that doesn't matter. They still took Ohio State to the wire. And now they finish with UCLA, at USC, Wisconsin, and at Iowa. And I'd argue that the only game I would say is the other team is definitively going to be favored would be Iowa. Like, I don't know if USC is going to be favored against Nebraska. Like, I'm picking USC to beat Washington. But man, like USC has not been good. Like they've been good in spurts. But remember, I mean, that's the same USC team that lost to Maryland on the road. Now, granted, they have to go to USC, but that hasn't necessarily been the hardest place to play. So I think if you're a Nebraska fan, like certainly UCLA you can beat. And then I think you look at the rest of the schedule, I think 7-5 or 8-4 is very much in reach. And I think a lot of people have been making, saying Matt Rule's overrated. He's not doing the same thing at Baylor. He's not doing this that he did at Baylor or at Temple. Listen, improving your team in the Big 12 or improving your team in a group of 5 conference is different than in the Big 10. Okay? Especially because he is trying to rebuild an entire culture, right? And he's doing it long term. Before anybody says, well, look at Curt Cignetti. Remember, Curt Cignetti had a lot of juice coming in because of where he was before. And we'll talk about that in a minute with him in Indiana. Curt Cignetti was able to bring a lot of his old program with him. Matt Rule didn't have that. He was in the NFL. And not only that, but he's trying to build from the ground up. He's got to do it in a conference that, honestly, Nebraska has not done a good job in since 2014. Actually, probably earlier than that. And so I just don't think – I think you have to kind of recognize what Matt Rule is trying to do, which is not just have a flash in the pan year where they look good and get to 10 wins. They're trying to reset a culture. They have a freshman quarterback. That means you got to take the good with the bad. For people who are like, well, Raiola didn't look good because of this. Raiola didn't look good because of that. Guess what? He's young. He'll improve. He'll get better. He already is getting better. So I think they're easily going to get a bowl game. And if they get to a bowl game, that's cause for celebration. All right. No, none of this. Well, they should have been 8-4. Listen, you've been living bowlless for 8 years. Beggars can't be choosers. Like, take 6-6, 7-5, 8-4. Like, take it and celebrate, because that's progress. It's progress, right? And not only that, you can celebrate. You guys have a win over a top 25 team in Colorado right now, and you beat them. You beat them pretty badly. So, like, this is a good team that probably should be on the cusp of the top 25, and I think actually could be by season's end. But I think, are you, should we fear a bowlless season? No, I think you get bowl eligible this week against UCLA. And I think actually you can look forward to 7-5, 8-4 minimum. So what about Rutgers bowl hopes? How scared should Rutgers fans be? It's a 10. It's a 10. I think Rutgers has fallen apart. And I am sad to say that, because I had such high hopes for them. But you look at the rest of their schedule, right? USC and UCLA might have been their easiest games left on the schedule. USC is probably a little bit of it's a toss-up between them and a couple other teams. But their last 4 games: Minnesota, at Maryland, Illinois, at Michigan State. I think they can get Maryland. I think they can get Michigan State. They do get Minnesota and Illinois at home. But I really like how Minnesota's been improving. I think Illinois is pretty good. And I think going on the road to Maryland in November, that has been a tricky spot for them. I think at Michigan State, as Aiden Childs continues to improve, I don't know, man. I think Rutgers fans need to brace themselves for the possibility that 4-8 or 5-7 is a real possibility. Which is sad, because I think they were on the precipice of having a magical season, if not for injuries, but they have not handled the injuries well either. And so it's a 10, and I am not sure. I'm not sure what to make of the coaching job of Greg Schiano. I really want to give him the benefit of the doubt, because I think he deserves it. But with the schedule the way it is, they should have been able to get to 6 wins. And I think it's rough that it's not there. So it's a 10. They should be very scared. Let's talk about USC. I'm not going to talk about bowl hopes. I do think they should be scared about their ability to make a bowl game. But I'm actually going to talk about something different here. How scared should they be of their future in the Big Ten? Their future in the Big Ten. Now, I want to give some context. The rest of their schedule this year for Southern Cal: at Washington, then they have a bye week, Nebraska at home, at UCLA, Notre Dame at home. I think they have enough, honestly, to win all of those games, and I think they're inconsistent enough to lose all those games. So I think most likely they go 6-6, maybe 7-5. But I don't feel good about either of those with the way they've played. And then if you turn the page to next year, this is their schedule next year: Missouri State, Georgia Southern, and they're at Notre Dame. That's their non-conference. At Illinois, at Nebraska, at Oregon, at Purdue. And then home against Iowa, Michigan, Michigan State, Northwestern, UCLA. As I look at that schedule, I think that the fear of USC's future in the Big Ten, at least for the next couple of years, is a 7. I think it's a 7. And I think part of it is, how do they finish this year? I think there is real concern about whether they make a bowl game. And then how does that carry into next year? Here's the thing that I would be encouraged by if you're a USC fan. The schedule gets a lot easier from last year. So if you look at their away schedule, it's 5 away games. At Notre Dame, that's hard. At Illinois, that's hard. At Nebraska, that's hard. At Oregon, that's really hard. At Purdue, not hard. Unless if Ryan Walters' replacement, which he's getting replaced at the end of this year, he's got to. I think that's fine. But then their home slate's encouraging. Iowa, I think they're going to lose quite a bit here. Let me just make sure I check that just to make sure I know what I'm talking about here. I think Iowa is, they're losing quite a bit. They're losing 4 guys on the offensive line. They're losing a lot on the defense. So they're going to be rebuilding a bit. They get Michigan. Things look very dicey for Michigan right now. Michigan State will be better next year, but I still don't think they're going to be great. Northwestern is up and down, and it's at home. UCLA is going to be in the middle of the second year of a rebuilding job. So their home slate, I would not be surprised to go 7-0 in their home slate if they keep building momentum. And that's the key. They've got to build momentum this year. So do I think USC this year, the danger of them missing a bowl game, I think is really high. But that's not the question. I'm asking their future trajectory. And if you look at their roster's young. If you look at the offensive line, it's a couple of freshmen and some juniors. You look at their defense, they certainly have some seniors on that defense, but they get another year of gelling with some of these players. And Kamari Ramsey's back. They've got some other guys that are going to plug in. And I think Danton Lynn can kind of recruit his guys as well and really get his guys to gel. So I still think their defense is going to struggle a bit next year as they continue to get more guys in that rank. So here's where I put it. I would put it at a 7. I think that would be my concern level, because I'm not sure they make a bowl this year. I'd put it at about 60-40 they go bowling, because I do think I'm picking them against Washington. I don't feel super confident about that because it's away, and I think they get UCLA. But again, that's a rivalry game. Anything can happen. I'm not confident about Nebraska, not confident about Notre Dame. I picked Nebraska to beat USC all the way back then. I'm going to stick to that because of the trenches. And I think Notre Dame is really playing well right now. So again, I think they can win both of those games, but I wouldn't say it. So I think if they're going 6-6, I think looking at their schedule for next year, I would pick it's probably going to be an 8-4, 9-3 type of year. The question is that enough to keep coaching continuity with Lincoln Riley and Danton Lynn to have 3 straight seasons that are disappointing after his first season with Caleb Williams? I don't know if you get rid of Lincoln Riley because of his name recognition and because what he proved at Oklahoma, but I do think it is something to consider. The other thing, and I'll go 1 year further here. 2026, and it's hard to project teams 2 years in advance, especially with the transfer portal and all that. But they only have 2 of their non-conference games set, which leads me to believe that their third non-conference game will probably be some sort of group of 5 team that's not very good. Fresno State's not bad. They get Notre Dame. and they go to Indiana. Who knows who's going to be coaching Indiana at that point, which again, we'll get to. They have to go to Happy Valley. They go to Rutgers. They go to UCLA. That's their road slate. That's not a bad road slate, other than Penn State. Even if Indiana maintains their quality, going to Indiana, that environment is typically not very hostile. So Penn State would be the big one there. Their home slate, though. Oh, so they also have at Wisconsin. Sorry, they have at Wisconsin. So that's two tough road games. And then at home, you have Maryland, Ohio State, Oregon, and Washington. I'm assuming that 3 of those 4 teams will be very good in Ohio State. I think Ohio State and Oregon will probably be top 10 teams. Washington, maybe a borderline top 25 team. Maryland, no offense, Maryland. So again, I think if you're going 3 years out, I'd still say 7, maybe even an 8 of concern, because if you're Lincoln Riley, at some point you've got to get a 10 or 11 win season at USC. So I think the concern level is high. You should be scared. You should be scared. Let's talk about Jedd Fisch's future. This is less about Washington and more about Jedd Fisch. A lot of people in the beginning of the year were like, he's going to be at Washington 1, maybe 2 years and then go to Florida. And my question is Florida going to want Jedd Fisch? Because he is not looking good. If I'm Jedd Fisch, my concern level is an 8. Because here's the rest of his schedule. USC at home, at Penn State, UCLA at home, at Oregon. This USC game's must win for him if he wants to make a bowl game. Because I don't think he's beaten Penn State on the road, and he's not beaten Oregon on the road. That's just not happening. So this is a must-win game for him. And I'm sorry, if you go 5-7 after leaving for a team that was just in the national championship game, like that's not a good look. I don't care. I don't care what is said about who they had to get to come from the transfer portal and all that stuff. The reality is you had a team that was at the national championship game a year ago. And I get it, completely different roster. But this team's talented enough to have been at least 7-5, 8-4. And said they're going to be fighting for their lives for a bowl game. So Jedd Fisch, if he goes somewhere else, he's like option C or D at best. Obviously, Curt Cignetti is going to be the guy that everybody's talking about. But, I mean, if I'm Florida, if I'm Auburn, if I'm, USC, say they want to get rid of Lincoln Riley at the end of this year, I don't think they will. None of them are going to be kicking the tires on Jedd Fisch first. He has not coached well. He has not called games well. His team has not been disciplined. Like, this is a team that I think has been a disappointment with all the talent that they have. So I think his future as a hot coach to get for a bigger job, it's an 8. Like he is option C or D at best for most schools that need a coach. Let's go to the opposite end of the spectrum. Indiana losing Curt Cignetti after 1 year. What is the likelihood he leaves? How much should Indiana fans fear? This is coming off a comment from my guy, Yankee Wolverine. Appreciate you listening. Appreciate you your thoughts. But Yankee Wolverine said that why on earth would Curt Cignetti stay at Indiana? And it's a valid question, right? It's a valid question. And to Yankee Wolverine's credit, he went to Indiana. So, like, he's an alum. And he was there, I think he said he was there during the Bill Mallory years. So, like, Bill Mallory was maybe one of the best coaches in the tenure of the Hoosiers. How much should Indiana fans fear Curt Cignetti leaving after year 1? And I'm going to say something that's probably very unpopular. I think it's a 9. I'm not going to go 10, but I think it's a 9. And I think part of the reason why is there's not much keeping him at Indiana. And if you look at the roster and you look at the starters, you start to realize how much of this season just worked out so well for him. I think I counted either 14 or 15 starters that are seniors. And then I think Elijah Surratt is probably also going to go in the NFL draft. He's played well enough where I think he can go and make some good money there. But this is a team that's senior laden. And a lot of those seniors came over from that JMU squad that he coached. So like he had such a great situation to be able to come in, bring some of his guys, mix them with some of the other key leaders on that Hoosier squad. And you look up and down the roster, a lot of seniors that are going to be heading out. A lot of key guys that he had really good relationships with before coming to Indiana. They're leaving. And I think unless Indiana can find a way to send the house to keep him, I think it's going to be really hard to convince him to stay at a place that historically has not been a football school. Particularly when you had a lot of the right things happen to stay. And that's not meant to be a shot at Indiana. It's more of if you look big picture at his situation with the transfers, with the senior leadership, with all of that. Because for him to keep Indiana relevant into next year, he's going to have to do a lot of the same things that he did a year ago, which is raid the transfer portal with a lot of key guys who are talented enough to come in and see Indiana as a group of 5 all-star destination. The problem is he can't really rely on relationships as much anymore. Like he was able to do that a lot because he coached in the group of 5 and he coached a lot of those guys and he brought them with him. He can't do that anymore because he hasn't been at those places, right? And if it goes back to JMU, guess what? He hasn't coached a lot of those guys because JMU has a lot of transfers right now that they're playing. So the dynamic changes. And so I get that, Curtis Rourke is leaving. I get that Taven Jackson, I think he's a good backup and he's probably going to be the starter next year. That's great. What about the offensive line? What about the defensive line? Maybe 2 of the most underrated units in America are their lines. That receiving core, the running back tandem, Lawson and Ellison. They're going to be gone. You're talking about a lot of turnover for this squad. And now you're telling Kurt, okay, now you got to do the same thing that you did this year, which currently they are 8-0, right? And they've got, they're 8-0. I think easily could be 10-2, 11-1, or even 12-0. Like we're talking about just a magical season. And then you're going to be asked to do that again. By the way, I mean, just looking at their schedule for next year, let me just look at this real quick. I should have looked this up ahead of time. I'm sorry. But you look at their schedule next year, their non-conference is a joke again. Kennesaw State, Old Dominion, Indiana State. They get Illinois, Michigan State, UCLA, Wisconsin at Iowa, Wisconsin, UCLA, Michigan State, Illinois at home. They got to go on the road to Penn State, to Oregon, to Iowa, at Maryland, at Purdue. That's a bit tougher schedule. That's actually quite a bit tougher than they had this year, especially with Michigan State ascending. Wisconsin is starting to ascend. And so you got lucky this year in the schedule. Like Wisconsin or Washington's down and Michigan is down. And, Northwestern is not a good version of themselves this year. And they drew Maryland, they drew UCLA when they were at their worst. And, But now, like you've got teams that are going to be ascending next year. I think Wisconsin and Iowa might be a bit tougher mid-range games for them. Whereas like the mid-range games for Indiana this year are more like the Washingtons and Michigan States and Nebraska, which I think Nebraska gave them their worst effort. But I like that's a tougher schedule. And you got to go to Autzen, you got to go to Penn State. That's two really tough venues to play. So that plus the turnover, it's like, okay, why would Kurt Cignetti stay? I think the pathway for Cignetti to stay is he is older, he's in his 60s. So maybe you say, I'm here for the long term and I want to be known as the guy who turned Indiana football around, which I think is very possible, right? But if you do that, you got to live in a reality that you're losing 2/3 of your starters, two-thirds to 3/4 of your starters, many of whom are high level guys. And you got to figure out who you're going to replace him with. And it's maybe not necessarily with recruiting, but it's transfer portal. How do you make sure that you set that up? So I think it would actually be easier for Cignetti to go to Florida or to go to Auburn or to go somewhere else where he is going to be wanted. And there's going to be a lot of teams who throw a lot of money at him to leave, where he can actually recruit. Because it's hard to recruit from the ground up at Indiana. I, for one, hope that doesn't happen, by the way. I love Kurt Cignetti. I love him at Indiana. I want Indiana to be competitive. I just don't know if it's feasible. And I don't know if it aligns with Kurt Cignetti's goals as he nears the end of his coaching tenure, right? He's in his 60s. He's got limited time. So I think it's a 9. All right. How scared should Illinois be that they finish on a bad note? I think Illinois fans probably think I'm picking on them all the time. I'm going to give this one a 4. I don't think it's likely, but I have a bit of concern. So this is Illinois, their last 4 games. They're home at Minnesota, or they're home against Minnesota. Then they're off. Then they're home against Michigan State. They're at Rutgers. They're at Northwestern. I do have them losing to Minnesota, which probably means they're going to win because every time I pick against Illinois, with the exception of Penn State and Oregon, they've won. So, Illinois fans rejoice. Illini Bubba, be happy. The off week happens, and then they get Michigan State at home, at Rutgers, at Northwestern. I don't think they, I think they are better than all 3 of the teams that they end with. And I think the Minnesota game might be a 50-50 toss up, right? So do I think that Illinois goes 10-2? No, I don't. I don't think they're talented enough to kind of avoid an upset somewhere. Do I think that they will go like collapse after getting their doors blown off against Oregon? No. I think Brett Bielema is too good of a coach. I think maybe where the concern is do they drop a game or 2 that they shouldn't? And particularly, I think the thing that I'm concerned about is if they do drop this next game to Minnesota and then they have a bye week, what do they do after the fact? Because then they get a game Michigan State. Granted, it's at home, but a Michigan State team that is improving. They're better along the trenches than people want to give them credit for. Aiden Childs is improving. Jonathan Smith's a good coach. Do they drop that one? And then you got a rivalry game with Northwestern at the end of the season. Rivalry games are always a bit wonky. So I think a bad season, like a bad end of the season, would be to go 2-2 over the next 4 games. I think a really bad would be either 1-3 or they drop them all. And I'm going to give it a 4 that either they either go 2-2 or 1-3 or 0-4. I think they probably go undefeated the rest of the way after this Minnesota game. But I do have a little bit of concern. Like, do they run out of gas? Because it's hard to live in a world where your running game's a little suspect and you're relying on the throw game and your defense. But I do think those last 3 games, I think the only threat would maybe be Michigan State. I think at Northwestern is a weird one, but I think Illinois fans should expect 9-3 and maybe have a little bit of trepidation that it falls to 8-4. That would be my official prediction, and I'd probably go 9-3. So I've got a 4 on that they finish on a bad note. What's the concern level? How scared should Oregon be that they pick up a loss? How scared should they be? Here's their remaining schedule: at Michigan, Maryland at home, at Wisconsin, off week, Washington at home. Now, preseason, I said I thought that they might struggle with the road trips to Michigan and to Wisconsin. I'll be really honest. I don't see anything from Wisconsin or Michigan that would scare me for Oregon right now. So I said 1-10. It's like a -2. There's no fear. There's no fear. I think they finished the regular season undefeated. I think they're strong defensively. I think they're strong running the ball. I think a lot of their struggles in the beginning of the season really had to do with their offensive line gelling. But I like this Oregon team. I think they're the best team in the country. And I think the things that the obstacles that are in their way, I think are easily solvable. Right? Like I was concerned about Wisconsin. I think Braden Locke is who he is. I don't think he can spring an upset against a team like Oregon. I think Michigan, I don't have any fear of their offense putting a dent into this Oregon defense, even if they're a little sleepy. And because of that, I don't think Oregon's going to be challenged. There's no Will Johnson, most likely no Will Johnson in the Oregon game. So who's going to cover those receivers? Like that I just think it's a bad matchup for Michigan and for Wisconsin. And Maryland and Washington, I think, are just not good teams right now. So I think Oregon I think they should be very, very confident that they finish undefeated going into the Big Ten championship game. Which leads to my last item. How scared should Michigan be that they would finish 6-6 or worse? Now, they're 5-3. They have Oregon this week at home. They're at Indiana. They're off Northwestern at home and at Ohio State. How concerned should they be that they're going to be 6-6 or worse? And I'd put this at a 10. Because you're talking about the best team in the country coming to your place. Then you got to go to Indiana, who's playing lights out. You get an off week. You get a Northwestern team who's physical. And, if you get them on the right day, they could be hard to handle. And then you got to go to Ohio State. Now, I don't know if the Ohio State game is nearly as daunting as it looked a couple weeks ago, but it's certainly more daunting than most of the teams they've played so far, maybe with the exception of Texas. And I'm not sure offensively they have what it takes to do much damage against Ohio State. I don't think they have enough to do enough damage against Oregon or Indiana. I think Northwestern is their best shot to be bowl eligible. And certainly they looked better against Michigan State, but like let's be honest, Michigan State probably should have beat Michigan. And I think if not for some bonehead coaching decisions, I shouldn't say bonehead, questionable decisions, I think Michigan State wins that game at Michigan, by the way. I'm concerned about injuries. I'm concerned about guys checking out. I feel like Michigan's coaching staff has not been very good. I do think it's good that they switch back to Davis Warren, and I think having him be more like your definitive starter with Alex Orji being in a package, I think is better for them. But this is just a brutal stretch, especially with how Indiana has improved. So I think it's a 10. I think it's gonna be rough. So that's it. This is the Halloween edition of the Big Ten Football Talk podcast. Again, make sure you like, follow, subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Check us out. Check me out on the Big Ten Huddle. Sundays and Tuesdays, and sometimes on Saturdays right after the games, we do our Power Rankings episodes. Make sure to check us out there. I'll be back next week with probably some playoff reactions, as well as some other thoughts. But I hope that this has been an insightful edition of the podcast. Again, make sure you leave a review, like, subscribe, comment. Grateful for you all. Happy Halloween. Take care. God bless.